In the early 1970s, an eccentric gay couple leave a crime-plagued life in Chicago for the rugged Appalachian foothills of North Georgia, hunting for peace and natural beauty. They found it and much more for a decade, until they made the fatal mistake of inviting death to join them in paradise.
I'm Mr. Ominous.
And I'm Dr. Grimm, covering shocking histories
And darkest mystery.
From the undeniable facts
To personal experience, our channel covers all things ominous
and grim. Good evening. I'm Dr. Grimm with a tale of shocking history to remind us earthly paradise always comes fully furnished with a devil in the wings, especially if you dare to name your pleasure palace Corpsewood Manor. Professor Charles Scudder and his partner Joey Odom were on a mission to realize their dreams in life. They escaped the crime of their native Chicago to find an unspoiled land where they could indulge their peculiar love of arts, music, and each other. They would build by hand together a castle dedicated to these dreams, with an intimately personal and private retreat at its center. Scandalizing the locals, they cultivated guests who appreciated their many special gifts, inviting only the chosen few into their personal sanctum, the Pink Pleasure Room. But paradise never lasts, and at the dark end of this dream, death was the final guest, who was mistakenly admitted to Corpsewood Manor and its innermost sanctum. It's time for a warning. Before we delve further into the grim details of tonight's dark tale, know this. We will do everything in our power to respect the victims of the crimes we are going to describe, but there is no way around the fact that certain passages in this episode are likely to evoke graphic or disturbing mental imagery. If you are triggered by ghastly details of horrific crimes, you'll want to listen to something else. But if you are morbidly attracted to knowing truth in its most grim details, as we are, that's precisely what we aim to share. So enjoy, and don't say we didn't warn you. If you're a fan of shocking history and dark mystery, you've come to the right place. Find our next episode on your platform by following this podcast, share it with a friend, and give us a review. Join a community of avid listeners at ominousandgrim.com for bonus content and benefits. That's OMINOUSANDGRYMM.com. And now, back to our story. Professor Charles Scudder and Joey Odom left the city life of Chicago in a black Jeep and headed for what they believed would surely be a laid-back and relaxed lifestyle in the South. Charles Scudder, an associate professor of pharmacology at Loyola University, had recently retired from his profession after turning 50, and, with the help of an inheritance from his mother, wanted to move as far away from city life as possible. Charles, very intelligent, handsome, with a big happy grin, enjoyed the reputation at the university as resident genius. He was well liked and popular by staff and students alike, and considered very successful, but he still felt something essential and important was missing from his life. Problems lurked around every corner for Charles. Marriage number 2 had soured and broken up, and not only that, one of his sons had recently died, and the other 3 had left the family nest, moving away to establish lives of their own. Besides these problems on the home front, Charles had grown weary of the politics and petty squabbles surrounding university life. Times in the early 1970s were rapidly changing, and Charles, growing older, didn't relish those changes. But with his mother's death came his inheritance, money, and freedom. Charles sold his palatial manor house in Chicago, which was designed by a student of Frank Lloyd Wright, and all the beautiful antique furniture. He gave everything else away. He then invited his friend and live-in housekeeper to accompany him down south to seek a better life in the rural mountains. With his companion, Joseph Odom, called Joey and aged 35, the two men happily set off on what they expected to be an exciting adventure. Both men looked forward to this new chapter of their life, getting back to nature with clean water to drink, pure air to breathe, building their own house, growing their own food. After much searching, they wound up in a small town in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, a remote community called Treon, Georgia. Charles paid $10,500 for a 40-acre large tract of forested land. They brought Charles's two dogs along, English Mastiffs. Good-natured and loyal, Mastiffs are huge and imposing dogs with short coats and massive heads. Here on the 40 acres of land, they believed they would finally find the peace and privacy they craved in order to live the lifestyle they preferred, and also build the fantasy-inspired house they both longed for on the top of a scenic mountain ridge on the property. Heading south, driving a black CJ5 Jeep that pulled a small camper, Charles and Joey encountered a fierce snowstorm that made driving hazardous. Snow still fell in giant flakes when they arrived on their newly purchased property. A coating of ice covered the land, making driving and walking treacherous. The two men slept in their small camper at night. By day, they prowled around through the snowy landscape, getting a sense of the lay of the land and making plans for the future. With two hulking dogs, they needed better lodgings, so eventually they bought a tent to provide more shelter. Trees grew thickly on this acreage that they chose. However, most of them, perhaps by choking each other out, had died. So Scudder, always a sharp wit, aptly named the property Corpsewood, and they would call their future house Corpsewood Manor. The two men enthusiastically went to work building their dream. Hauling in tons of red brick, they proceeded to build an elaborate castle-like structure with an octagon-shaped portico or gazebo that supported a sun deck with a huge pink-painted gargoyle keeping watch from the roof. It's not known if either man had any previous construction experience, but the brick house they both built looked pretty amazing. The house featured bay-shaped ends fitted with glass block windows to let in ample light, and this was very important since there was no electricity. In the beginning, however, the house was no more than a dream, but the two men were determined. They cut down trees and hauled away brush. They dug a well to provide fresh water. With picks and shovels, they dug out the earth to create a sturdy foundation for the structure that would become Corpsewood Manor. Charles and Joey created interesting and one-of-a-kind architectural features for the new house. Soaring brick arches and stained glass windows. One magnificent colored glass windows that Charles created represented the head of a deity of mysterious origins named Baphomet, or Baphomet. This intersex deity with male genitalia and female breast was allegedly worshipped by the Knights Templar and reputedly a symbolic key of Hermetic magical arts. But it remains unclear if this was actually true, although it is a well-known rumor of cultural lore. Another window of stained glass that adorned Corpsewood Manor portrays a human skull or death's head, also created by Charles, the multi-talented owner of Corpsewood. The two men labored over a year to complete the house, utilizing their imagination and talents to create a uniquely personal and memorable home for themselves. On the side of the manor house, the men built a large storage building of wood, 3 stories tall. Here they kept their stores of food and other supplies on one floor and housed a flock of chickens on another. They called this building the chicken house. After completing the house, They planted a garden for growing vegetables as well as a rose garden. Charles and Joey's dramatic and gothic fantasy style continued on the inside of the manor house. Statues of devil-like figures and black candles stood on well-appointed tables. Tapestries portraying human skulls and skeletons hung on the walls. And a couple of the real things sat on Charles's desk and gazed down with empty eye sockets from the top of a grandfather clock. The Victorian furniture throughout the house was very elaborately carved in heavy and baroque hardwoods. Most of the townsfolk of nearby Treon did not appreciate their new neighbors as the two men drove around town in a jet-black CJ5 Jeep that had a pentagram emblazoned on a side panel in what may best be described as an in-your-face manner. And a cryptic sign now stood guard by the tree-lined entrance of Corpsewood. Right off Mountain View Road, a wooden sign with painted letters read, "Beware of the Thing." These plain-living and conservative people didn't know what to think of the new strangers, their pentagram-adorned Jeep, or the cryptic Thing sign leading to their house. Some locals even claimed to have seen the Thing. They said it was a violent demon that would attack anyone foolish enough to venture onto the property. Locals began to call Corpsewood the Devil Worshippers' Mountain, and most stayed away from the place. Rumors began to spread, describing bizarre rituals taking place among the dead and dying trees, replete with black-robed figures chanting and singing. And rumors began to spread around town that Charles and Joey were gay. For context, the movie Deliverance, depicting homosexual rape in the wilds of Appalachia, was released that same year. This also surely contributed to the fear generated by the two strangers in town. Most of the townsfolk stayed away from Charles and Joey. Some of the locals, however, were very friendly toward the two men, and Charles and Joey responded with gracious hospitality. They frequently invited guests to stay and dine at Corpsewood Manor. Charles and Joey even hosted a wedding for a local couple, held in their lovely rose garden. Charles provided enchanting music by playing his harp, for he was an extremely talented musician. Joey Odom had only completed the 5th grade in school, but proved amazingly talented and a first-class cook. He prepared unforgettable meals for the guests, almost unbelievably, all cooked on a primitive wood stove, with no gas or electricity. His stove was simple, but the menus were elaborate, with many delicious courses. Charles kept his musical talents and technical chops well oiled, as he would play his beautiful harp of gold for entertainment, for they had no television. Instead, he filled the house with lovely music. Some of the guests to Corpsewood brought gifts of fruit, which Charles would turn into home-brewed wine by the next season, which they then served in elegant silver goblets. But the next chapter of our story was not inside the beautiful Corpsewood Manor, but outside, in the 3-story wooden tower called the Chicken House. And it was this barn that was the final destination of the evening, the denouement, for the most privileged of the Corpsewood guests. The 3rd floor of the chicken house could only be reached by a ladder through a trap door. This top floor contained the infamous Pink Pleasure Room, the favorite room of some of the visitors to Corpsewood. Several mattresses lay on the floor of this room, and piles of suggestive photos and similarly themed magazines. Kerosene lamps softly lit the pink-hued walls and reflected off the tools of that practice known as B&D. The homemade wine flowed freely here for the participants, and some say other substances did as well. One of the young locals, Avery Brock, a 17-year-old, first asked permission of Charles to go hunting on Corpsewood. Avery had left home, kicked out actually, by an angry father, and led a rootless life. For a while the young man prowled around the property of Corpsewood. Then he joined the others in the Pink Room. After several visits to the Pink Room, Avery told his friend, Tony West, about Corpsewood and its remarkable inhabitants. Tony wanted to check it out as well, the manor house and the goings-on in the Pink Room. Tony was 30 years of age, had a long history of mental instability and trouble with the police. He'd spent considerable time in mental institutions and a jail cell throughout his short life. But with Avery's recommendation, he too visited the Corpsewood estate. After enjoying Charles and Joey's generous hospitality for several months, drinking their wine and eating their fine food, not to mention visits to the Pink Room, Tony decided to take things one step further. He wanted to rob the two men. Both Avery and Tony figured the two men that lived at Corpsewood must be rich. The harp of gold Charles so often played must have cost a fortune alone. Plus, all the beautifully carved furniture looked very valuable. It seemed the two men never seemed to want for anything materially and lived lavishly. Therefore, they must have plenty of money, and in the limited experience of Avery and Tony, this money had to be hidden somewhere at Corpsewood itself. Avery and Tony developed a grim determination to find and take that cache of money for themselves. One chilly day in December of 1982, Tony and Avery decided to put their devious plot into action. They invited two of their teen friends along, a dating couple, not breathing a word to them about the planned robbery. When the four people arrived at the manor house, Joey happily cooked up a sumptuous feast for them all to enjoy. Charles treated his guests to fabulous music with his harp. Afterwards, they all retired to the Pink Room. As Charles lit the kerosene lamps, the group sat down on the mattress. The newcomers stared around them. Joey didn't join the others. He stayed behind in order to clean up the remains of the feast and tidy the kitchen. Avery Brock had brought along a container of something he called Toodaloo, which was a combination of paint thinner mixed with other toxic substances. Sniffing or huffing the mixture produced a brief high, which made it popular with the local teenagers. Charles drank his wine and watched the others as they inhaled the toxic mixture. Avery soon excused himself and left the room, only to return a few minutes later with a rifle. When Charles, avidly chatting with the others, looked up and saw the gun in Avery's hand, he merely smiled, thinking it was some sort of joke or a new game. However, Avery wasn't joking. He grabbed a handful of Charles' hair and jerked his head back. He demanded to know where the money was kept. Charles tried to explain they had no money hidden at the manor or on the grounds of Corpsewood, that they really didn't have much money at all. Charles did have a small amount of money left over from his inheritance, but it was kept in the local bank. He patiently explained all this to Avery. Now Avery became infuriated and violent. He tied a cloth gag around Charles' face. While Tony stood guard over an astonished Charles in the Pink Room, Avery took his rifle and made his way back to the main house and the kitchen, where Joey diligently scrubbed the mountain of pots and pans and dinner dishes. From the chicken house, the astonished group heard the sharp sounds of gunshots ring through the air. Then more shots. Tony then forced Charles and the other two teenagers down the ladder and out of the chicken house. They entered the manor's kitchen. A terrible sight met Charles's eyes. His beloved partner lay dead on the floor, and so did the two English mastiffs, who apparently had been asleep when they were cruelly killed. Tony and Avery now demanded that Charles reveal the secret hiding place of the money. They beat him and threatened him. Charles, overcome with emotion at the sight of his dead partner, and I'm sure his two dead dogs as well, cried out in anguish. "I deserve this," he cried. Tony responded by cruelly gunning him down with 5 bullets to the forehead. As Charles and Joey lay dead, Avery and Tony went berserk. They ransacked the manor house, jerking open drawers and cabinet doors, overturning furniture, knocking over glass and ceramic objects, searching everywhere for the non-existent large stash of cash. Finally, they gave up the hopeless task. There was no money hidden at Corpsewood Manor. The two killers then gathered up some items they thought might be valuable and took them to the black jeep, which they also planned to steal. They tried to take the giant golden harp, but it proved too big to transport, so they left it in the yard. Afterwards, Avery and Tony used death threats against the two teenagers that had innocently accompanied them to Corpsewood. If they told anyone about the murders, they too would be killed. Tony and Avery figured they would find safety from the police in Mexico, so they jumped into the black jeep and drove off into the night, bound for the Mexican border. Somewhere down the road, it dawned on the pair that perhaps the black jeep, sporting the distinctive pentagram design, made them highly conspicuous. They knew they needed another, less distinctive vehicle. Late that night, they pulled into a quiet rest stop on Interstate 20 in Mississippi, scouting for a car to hijack. They noticed a young man sleeping nearby in a red 1980 Toyota Corolla. It was Lieutenant Kirby Phelps, a handsome young Navy lieutenant with blonde hair and glasses. Very intelligent and ambitious, Kirby had worked hard and graduated from Georgia Tech a few years before. Kirby had driven from Jacksonville, Florida that same day. He planned to spend Christmas with his mother in Oklahoma City, then continue on to his new naval assignment. Tony and Avery overpowered Kirby as he slept. They forced him from his car, then proceeded to rob him. Dragging him into the nearby woods, Tony ruthlessly shot the young man as he tried to escape. Meanwhile, back at Corpsewood Manor, it took 4 days before a friend dropped by for a visit. When no one answered the door, the friend walked in and saw the blood-spattered walls and found the dead bodies. He quickly called the Chattooga County Police. The county police, after first viewing the satanic paraphernalia and the pornography and the tools of B&D, called in the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. When the news leaked out, the press jumped into action. The newspapers printed lurid headlines describing two reclusive devil worshippers that lived in the North Georgia mountains. Photographs of the grisly crime scene splashed every page, along with lots of bloody details. The police very quickly determined who had brutally murdered the residents of Corpsewood and the two dogs. They issued warrants for the two men's arrest. As Tony and Avery sped south towards Mexico, they began to quarrel. In a fit of anger, Avery exited the car at one point and went his own way. After abandoning Tony, Avery began hitchhiking back to his hometown of Treon. He called his mother from Marietta, Georgia, and learned about the warrant for his arrest. Tired of running from the law, he went into a gas station and confessed his crime to the attendant. The attendant called the police, who quickly arrested Avery. Tony got as far as Missouri before he ran out of gas. He abandoned the stolen red Toyota Corolla. Hungry and exhausted, he searched for a police officer, eventually finding one on Christmas Eve, and confessed his crime. After the arrest, a media circus really began, publishing lurid stories and focusing more on the fact that the victims were devil worshippers than on the fact that they were victims who'd been cruelly murdered by men that posed as good friends. In life, being perceived as devil worshippers obviously gave Charles and Joey a thrill. It was their fantasy and their game. They enjoyed the reputation of being different and maybe even a little wicked. It provided an aura of mystery and glamour to scandalize the locals and perhaps provided zest to their private life together. Even as a professor, Charles enjoyed being different. He playfully dyed his hair purple and even kept a pet monkey to amuse his guests. his colleagues thought of him as merely eccentric, not dangerous in any way. He was just too friendly and good-natured. At heart, it seems Charles and Joey were simply two peaceful, nature-loving partners with a romantic taste for the Gothic, and who lived to entertain their friends and have fun. All the rest was just window dressing. But newspaper accounts described the Corpsewood Manor as if it were some sort of creepy dungeon, dank and dark, walls dripping with slime, decorated with human skulls. The trials of Tony and Avery proceeded in 1983. Avery, who shot Charles and Joey and participated in the murder of Lieutenant Kirby Phelps, received 3 consecutive life sentences. At first, Tony swore he was innocent of the killings. He claimed the only reason Avery killed the 2 men and their dogs was because of embarrassment about some of the things he participated in with Charles and Joey. Tony made all sorts of outlandish claims in and out of court, playing the role of the victim of a Satanist warlock. He claimed Charles had spiked the homemade wine with a hallucinogenic, of which no trace was ever found. He claimed Charles's harp had some sort of evil power over people, and that he'd been bewitched so that he had no power over his actions. But even if we were to entertain these statements as possible, if the harp made him do the first murders, why shoot and kill the young lieutenant who knew nothing of Corpsewood? Why not just take his car and let him go alive and unharmed? When asked why he murdered Charles, Tony replied that Charles needed to die because he was a devil on earth. Finally, the court gave Tony a death sentence, which was eventually reduced to life imprisonment. But there yet remains a question I alluded to at the opening of our story. The question of mysteriously grim and ominous portents of a regrettably true and sad end. Shortly before his death, Charles painted his self-portrait. The figure in the picture appears to have a cloth covering his mouth, very much like the gag Charles was forced to wear before he died, and there are 5 bloody bullet holes in his forehead, just where Tony West shot him in real life a few months later. All that really remains to tell of this story is, well, the remains of Corpsewood Manor. Corpsewood Manor itself, and the notorious chicken house, along with its pink pleasure room tucked away at the top, mysteriously burned to the ground one night, only a few months after the murders took place. Only a portion of the red brick structure remains. Much of it has been knocked down or has fallen over time, and the spot is massively overgrown with vines. Here and there, vandals have spray-painted graffiti in bright red. Charles and Joey are long since gone. The surrounding woods are quiet except for occasional bird song. However, the locals still continue to refer to the place as Devil Worshipper's Mountain. And local legend says that if you take even a single one of those red bricks from Corpsewood, you'll be cursed for the rest of your life. And perhaps the reality of that curse that now lies upon the ruins of Corpsewood is superstition itself, which so often debars members of the same community from sharing their separate worlds of imagination with one another and compassion for one another, which, as this story shows, is a situation that can turn even a private paradise into a hellish and fatal nightmare. If you've enjoyed this episode of Ominous and Grim and want more shocking history and dark mystery, don't forget to follow this podcast, share the episode with your friends, and review us on your favorite platform. Finally, sign up at ominousandgrim.com for members-only benefits. That's OMINOUSANDGRYMM.com. And until next episode, be sure to look behind you.